Welcome to the Soapbox here on 90.9 WMPG, Southern Maine's community radio station from the University of Southern Maine. My name is Eric Poulin, and my guest this evening is a ex-Marine, a Vietnam veteran, an archivist, and an historian, and he's currently working as an adjunct professor at the University of Southern Maine. Christopher Beam, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here, Eric.
So the reason I asked you to be on the show, Chris, is that you've had the privilege of sort of archiving most of the hours of the Nixon tapes. Is that right? 1,700 hours or so?
Well, actually, if I could go back a little bit, yes, I worked for 4.5 years on the staff at the National Archives that was processing Richard Nixon's presidential papers. And I was actually on the staff that specifically worked on his huge collection of audio recordings, the White House tapes. The White House tapes consists of about 3,700 hours of conversation that were recorded between February of 1971 and July of 1973. And I estimate that I've listened to about 1,500 hours of them. So
Okay.
It's a fraction, but it's a large fraction of the tapes.
Okay.
Of the conversations.
How many people were on the team at the National Archives with you?
Well, it varied. There was a section leader, and then there were two other professional archivists. I was one of them. And then we had probably anywhere from 1 to 3 archives technicians working at different times that I was there. Now, the project went on for a long time. I was there for 4.5 years, and then I transferred to another unit at the National Archives.
Okay, and so the reason you've been sort of making the rounds in the local media lately is that it's the 40th anniversary last month of Nixon's resignation. And I'd like to get there, but before we do, I'd like to talk a little bit about you and a little bit about the Vietnam War. Now, you became a Marine in '67, is that right? You enlisted in '67?
Yes.
Was that a voluntary enlistment?
Yes, it was. I was scheduled to graduate from college in June of 1967. Of course, the Vietnam War was escalating then. At the time, I have to admit this, at the time I thought the United States was doing the right thing, and there was a draft on, and so I did volunteer for the Marine Corps. I went into the officer training program. I have to say, and this has some relevance to what I heard later on, is that I changed my mind on the war. I came back from Vietnam concluding that it had been a terrible mistake to get involved there. But that's why I wound up in the Marine Corps. And then I served in Vietnam in late 1968 till July of 1969.
And what was it that you saw or experienced in Vietnam that changed your mind?
Well, there was nothing specific. I was lucky. I was not in the infantry or artillery where I was really in the line of fire. The only time I was ever in the line of fire was in February of 1969 when our area was hit with some rockets and mortars. I was in a logistical unit. I was in motor transport. So most of the time I was in a rear echelon area, managing a truck platoon. So there was nothing really specific. I didn't have any traumatic incident. I didn't see any atrocities or anything like that. I did come to the conclusion that the American presence kind of overwhelmed this rather poor society. And also another thing that really kind of undermined my support for U.S. policy is that I looked into the history of Vietnam. I always like to say to students that studying the past or studying history can be a very subversive undertaking. And it was with me. And that is, I started to question a lot of the basic assumptions that led the United States to become that deeply involved in the Vietnam War.
And so you came back and you were somewhat disillusioned, let's say, with U.S. foreign policy and with President Nixon as well at that point?
Well, I was certainly against the war in Vietnam, and yes, I felt that the United States foreign policy was oriented the wrong way towards supporting elite groups, reactive, overstating the real threat of communism, and so forth. My discontent with Richard Nixon was, he did not get involved. He did not get the United States involved in Vietnam. Those were decisions made by his predecessors. But Nixon had embarked on a course of a very gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops in Vietnam, and I felt that the United States, if the war was a mistake, then just get out. The United States really had no business there. The other thing is, and then this kind of dawned on me, is that Nixon was kind of playing a domestic game of playing off different groups against each other. And I didn't like that. I thought that was very divisive and manipulative.
Did you feel he was using the war for domestic political purposes?
No, I don't think he was using it for domestic political purposes. Now, of course, all the judgments I'm making now about what I thought in 1969, 1970 are colored by the things that I heard on the tapes. Mm-hmm. No, the war was something that he, in a sense, inherited. But he was not willing to just say, we're going to get out. This was my predecessors got us into this mess, and so we're just going to pull out. He operated on the very same assumptions of his predecessors, particularly Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, and that is that the United States must defend an independent, separate, anti-communist South Vietnam, and that meant that the United States was up against this very virulent form of Vietnamese nationalism. And that's what we were fighting in Vietnam, not communism.
And that was a spontaneous people's uprising, was it not? And it was not...
Well, it wasn't spontaneous. I
Okay.
mean, at least, I've had the good fortune of being able to teach courses on the Vietnam War here at USM and elsewhere. It wasn't spontaneous. I mean, it was organized. I mean, you had people like Ho Chi Minh and many others who, for decades, had been agitating and trying to organize against first French colonialism. And then and at the tail end of the French colonial period, that's when the United States started getting involved because the key resistance movement was the Vietnamese Communist Party.
Was it genuinely nationalistic, or was it, say, colored by Soviet influence, Soviet communist influence?
That question comes up. Was Ho Chi Minh a nationalist first or a communist first or whatever? In a way, I think that's not a correct formulation of the problem. He was a nationalist. He was scouting around from his early days for some way to free his country from French colonial rule. He tapped into the communist movement starting around 1919 when he joined the French Communist Party because it was the only party in France. He was in exile in France that supported colonial independence. No other party, even the socialists, weren't doing that. And he did accept Vladimir Lenin's notion that the only way to make a revolution was to have a very tightly knit, tightly disciplined, top-down ruled underground political party. And he was also scouting around for outside support. And the only country that at least paid lip service to colonial independence was the Soviet Union. So that's, he was doing what, independence fighters usually do, including people who are fighting for for American independence. They look towards France, the French monarchy for help.
So did you feel that America's involvement was a mistake because the threat was overstated, or what was it specifically?
Well, I came to the conclusion, and I mean it wasn't necessarily independent. I was reading about and hearing what other people were saying, but that what the United States was doing was trying to keep Vietnam divided, and that was running up against Vietnamese nationalism. That what was really at work was not communist expansionism, but nationalism. Another thing too is that I came to believe that the notion of a monolithic communist empire that has one goal in mind, world domination and expansion, really was false. And in fact, ironically, I think Nixon proved it by opening up to China, communist China, and pursuing détente with the Soviet Union, because by the time Nixon was doing that, communist China and the Soviet Union were deadly enemies. So they're not in cahoots.
Right.
that sort of thing. So I thought, well, why all this bloodletting? And the other thing, too, is that the United States, when I was over there, there were over 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, and this is mostly in South Vietnam, and this is, a very small country, very poor. The area was devastated. A good part of the population were refugees. Now, it wasn't all United States military action. This happens when there's fighting going on. But, the United States certainly was an enormous contributor to the disruption of this society. And the other thing, too, I was starting to hear a lot of stuff I heard, that really kind of turned me against the war came from fellow GIs. Comments that the South Vietnamese military just didn't seem to be very motivated. Well, wait a minute. Supposedly, according to the U.S. narrative, is that the United States was defending South Vietnam's independence.
Mm-hmm.
Well, these guys are well armed, well supplied, they're well trained, or at least they're getting good American advice, and they're not standing up. They need 500,000 American troops to back them up. Reports of corruption in the South Vietnamese government, constant wondering why the Viet Cong, who are the southern insurgents, always seem to be better led, more tenacious than their South Vietnamese army counterparts.
Much better equipped, right?
Well, the South Vietnamese army was better equipped,
yeah.
But the Viet Cong, were holding their own.
That's right. Yeah.
And doing very well. And of course, the North Vietnamese, although they were well trained, you'd hear statistics like they're getting support from China and the Soviet Union, but it's about a tenth of the amount that the United States was giving. Where's all this money going to?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't the South Vietnamese stand on their own 2 feet?
So what year did you come back from Vietnam?
I came back in July of 1969.
Okay, so that's a pretty tumultuous time in American history, right? You've got the civil rights movement happening. You've got the youth-led protest movement happening against the war. So what is the broader political context when you come back? Is there a growing sense of disillusionment, or was there still the majority of Americans behind?
Well, it's hard to tell. Clearly there was a growing impatience with the war. And again, all of this is colored by not only what I heard on the Nixon tapes, but I've done a lot of studying in Vietnam because I've been teaching courses on it. Actually, when I got back, it was kind of a quiet period because people were trying to figure out, well, what's Nixon going to do? He'd just been inaugurated in January of 1969, and he really hadn't made his specific plans on Vietnam very clear. Of course, everybody was aware of what was going back in the States. I think the civil rights movement was kind of falling apart. The country was clearly becoming, and this was seen in the military, racially polarized, very much so. Protest movement, I didn't see any protests. The protests really reignited in the fall of 1969 when it became clear that Nixon was going to pull out of Vietnam, but very, very, very slowly, And we now know that he was also conducting a secret bombing campaign in eastern Cambodia and things like that. So I think there was a kind of, and as far as the public was concerned, it's hard to say. You'd hear people say, well, we've got to stay in there. If the United States pulled out all of a sudden, the communists would take over, and at that time, 25,000 lives would have been were in vain. That kind of argument.
American lives.
American lives.
A lot more Vietnamese lives.
Many more Vietnamese lives, yes.
Okay, so let's jump ahead to, was it 72 when Watergate happened?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so is there a connection to Vietnam? Or was that strictly political maneuver?
There is a connection to Vietnam, and I'm glad we have some time on this radio show because it's not really a direct connection. But this is stuff I've learned later. I was in graduate school when the Watergate break-in occurred on June 17, 1972, in American history, and I was outraged, that operatives from Nixon's reelection campaign had been caught trying to burglarize and put bugs in the office of the opposition party. I didn't see any connection with Watergate, but with Vietnam. But later on, there clearly did emerge because the 4 Miami Cubans who were caught burglarizing and 2 other operatives who were directing this team, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, had been involved in a surreptitious entry into the psychiatrist's office of Daniel Ellsberg in September of 1971. Now, for history, for history buffs, they might remember this. Daniel Ellsberg was he had been a former Defense Department official. He was now working with the Rand Corporation. And he had been involved in constructing, in 1967 and 1968, a very comprehensive collection of documents and a history of decision-making in Vietnam. And it was classified top secret. And he tried to get it declassified, and he couldn't do it. So he started leaking excerpts to the New York Times. They became known as the Pentagon Papers. That occurred started in June of 1971. And the New York Times, the U.S. government, the Nixon administration, took the New York Times to court. It went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't issue an injunction against the Times. So the Nixon re-election committee, or the people in the White House, a group that called the Plumbers, who were trying to stop leaks of classified information, were trying to figure out a way to discredit Daniel Ellsberg. And so G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, and the Miami Cubans went out to California, broke into the psychiatrist's office to try to find damaging information on Ellsberg. Apparently they didn't find anything, but they did trash the office to make it look like a drug break-in. Well, when they got back, the people who were managing this unit got cold feet and shut down this plumbers unit. But the problem is, what do you do with Hunt and Liddy? The Miami Cubans just went back to their regular lives in Miami, but Hunt and Liddy, E. Howard Hunt was a former CIA operative. G. Gordon Liddy was a former Treasury Department investigator. So they couldn't fire these guys, really, so they reassigned them to the committee to reelect the president. And
could they not fire them because they had too much information
they couldn't fire them. First of all, the break-in of the psychiatrist's office was a secret, and they didn't want that revealed, especially with an election year coming up. So they were afraid that these guys would, especially Hunt, would spill the beans on illegal activities.
All right, so they decide to keep them around, Hunt and Liddy.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily need to use them for any more illegal activity, right? Why did they choose to?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I've ever satisfactorily resolved the question of why did they decide to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office complex. I mean, the National Committee, the party national committees are basically housekeeping operations. About the only explanation I've heard that I would agree with is that Larry O'Brien, who was chair of the Democratic National Committee, was a savvy political operator that maybe, they wanted to find out something about strategy, maybe he had some information that they didn't want. They wanted to know what he knew, okay? So actually what happened was in May of G. Gordon Liddy was the one who came up with this elaborate plan to undermine the Democratic president, the primaries and the campaign. For example, G. Gordon Liddy wanted to rent out a fancy yacht at the Democratic Convention in Miami, hire high-class prostitutes to seduce Democrats and then take compromising photos and so forth.
Classy fellow.
Yeah, yes. But anyway, he was the one who came up with a plan to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters and plant bugs on the telephones. And they did that actually in May of 1972. The problem is they were using very cheap equipment and the bugs didn't work, so they had to go in again. And that's when they got caught. Now, when you think about it, and actually Nixon raised this in the tapes, it was kind of a stupid thing to do because, what kind of information are they going to get? And by May of 1972, Nixon had already had a political triumph in his trip to China in February of 72. At the time of the first break-in, he was in the Soviet Union. That got a lot of good buzz for him back home. The Democratic Party was falling apart. Their lead candidate, Ed Muskie of Maine, virtually stopped campaigning in April of '72, and the candidate that the Republican or the Nixon reelection committee most wanted to get the nomination, George McGovern, was well on his way to getting that nomination. So why take a chance? Because now I'm not a burglar. I'm not a congenital criminal. But one would think, okay, what would be the key principle if you're going to do something illegal? Make sure that it doesn't compromise the president. What would happen if these guys got caught? And they did.
Right, of course. So let me ask you this. Knowing all that you know now, we know Nixon was involved in ordering that. Is that correct?
There's no evidence that Nixon ordered it or knew about it beforehand.
Okay.
I don't think there's any. There have been allegations of that. I didn't hear anything on the tapes that suggested that. And my sense is that he probably would have thought it was a stupid idea.
Okay.
A stupid idea and not really necessary.
So is that what it boils down to? It was just a stupid idea, or was there some rationale that you can think of?
I don't think there was any rationale. I think this was cooked up by G. Gordon Liddy.
Something to do.
And he got approval, though, from, well, this was another problem. He got approval from the chair of the committee to reelect the president, and that was John Mitchell. Now, John Mitchell had been Attorney General under Nixon. So, and it had been close to Nixon professionally and personally. So there was that kind of connection, you know. But he got approval to do this, and somebody in the reelection committee didn't have enough power to say, this is stupid, we've got to shut this thing down. You know, this is way too dangerous.